Madam President, last Friday, the Social Security Trustees Report and the Medicare Trustees Report were both released. They showed that as large as our debt and deficits are now, without tackling these two entitlements, our future debts and deficits will dwarf current levels. In fact, this year alone, Medicare is running a cash flow deficit of more than $32 billion. This is the largest deficit ever for this program. Likewise, Social Security will run a cash flow deficit of $46 billion this year. This requires the Treasury to finance these programs through additional borrowing, adding even more to our deficit. In total, though, Social Security faces a $6.5 trillion unfunded liability. The reason for this, according to the report, is the aging of our society. As we live longer and as the size of families has decreased, the number of workers financing benefits has steadily decreased. For example, in 1950, there were 16.5 workers for every Social Security recipient, and life expectancy was 69 years old. By 1960, the number of workers supporting each recipient was just more than half of what it was 10 years before. Now there are fewer than 3 workers for each beneficiary, and by 2040 it will be just over 2. Around the same time, in 2036, Social Security's trust fund will run out of all of the, quote, IOUs that the government has issued to it. After this point, Social Security will be able to pay just over 75% of the current benefits. Now, Madam President, that's an important point, because some say that Social Security doesn't need to be reformed because these benefits are still going to be able to be paid. And I think we have to remind ourselves of how this will work. But you can see the demographic trend here, what's happening in the country. Going back to the 1950s, when you had a life expectancy that was shorter, you had more people paying in, 16.5 for everyone that was drawing out. Now we're looking at 2 or 3 people paying in for everyone drawing out. And of course, the life expectancy now is up to about 78 years average. And then in 2040, as I said earlier, 2 people paying in for everyone drawing out. So the crunch is coming. We all know that. We can predict it. We see it coming. And of course, the expectation is that because the Social Security Trust Fund will be able to pay benefits until sometime in the 2037 time frame, that everything's okay. We don't need to take steps to rectify this situation today. The problem with that, Mr. President, is that the so-called IOUs in the Social Security Trust Fund are just more borrowing. When we get to that year, when we get to the 2036, 2037 time frame, there will only be about 75 cents coming in for every dollar that will have to pay it out. And so you will have people literally who will take a huge cut in benefits, or we would have to undergo a massive tax increase, payroll tax increase, in order to make that up, or dramatically increase the borrowing of the federal government. Because in fact, those IOUs and the trust funds are not an economic benefit that can be, or an economic asset that can be used to pay a cash benefit. It is simply borrowing. We all know that. And the important date, I think, in my mind at least, is the date at which the amount that we receive coming into the Social Security Trust Fund in the form of payroll taxes no longer exceeds the amount that we are paying out in the form of benefits. That happened this year to the tune of $45 billion. Many of us have committed to preserving these programs for existing retirees and for those who are about to retire soon. If we don't reform Social Security, these cuts of nearly 25% would be instant and automatic, giving retirees no time to make other arrangements. Now, working back from the 2036 date to ensure that the program remains solvent and can pay out benefits to future generations requires us, Madam President, to take action today. We don't have the luxury of time. We can't afford to wait. The sooner we take action, the more time that current generations have to prepare for a realistic level of benefits and not be blindsided when their benefits are dramatically cut. Without reform, Americans age 42 and younger will not see full Social Security benefits when they retire. In addition to the aging population, the rapidly rising cost of health care is placing enormous pressures on the Medicare system. Despite the recently enacted health care reform legislation, health care costs rose by over 7% in 2010 compared to about a 1% increase in all other goods and services in the economy. The Medicare trustees reported that the program has an unfunded liability of nearly $36.8 trillion and that the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be completely insolvent by the year 2024. Medicare spending is expected to rise from 3.6% of our entire economy, of our gross domestic product, in 2010, which is where it is today, to 10.7% in 2085. That means that the amount of money the government spends on health care is going to triple over the next 75 years. Now that, Madam President, unbelievably, is the rosy picture of what will happen. Due to the double counting that occurred in unrealistic savings and targets that were included in the health care reform bill that was passed last year, these numbers are going to be invariably worse if further action isn't taken. And finally, the Medicaid system also faces nearly all the same increasing cost and funding challenges as the Medicare system, while also failing to provide states with the flexibility that they need to provide quality care for beneficiaries. Unfortunately, this administration and the last Congress made these problems even worse. Instead of reforming these entitlement programs, they created yet another new entitlement program called the Class Act, which even the Democrat chairman of the Senate Budget Committee has called a Ponzi scheme. Included in the same health care bill passed last year was a massive expansion of Medicaid and the creation of new credits for individuals to buy insurance, all of which add to the budget burdens that we're already experiencing. If these programs are not reformed, we know what we will face. Under the Congressional Budget Office's alternative fiscal scenario, which makes realistic assumptions about the growth of these programs, spending in 2020 would comprise 25.9% of GDP, more than 25% above the historical average. It would continue to grow, and in 2035, spending would comprise 35.2% of GDP, or nearly 60% more than the historical average. In that same year, deficits would comprise nearly 16% of GDP of our entire economy, and debt would be 185% of GDP. Now, I want to illustrate that in the form of a chart here, Madam President, and just show you what this would look like. Historical average for deficits, 3%, as I said. If you look at what we faced in the last 40 to 50 years roughly, and where that is headed in these out years. Now, if you look at 2010, how this thing has spiked up just in the last couple of years here, we've added massively to the debt, and the stimulus spending, the massive health care entitlement program, all of which are going to make this even worse. But we're on a trend right now, if you draw this out and follow this trajectory, where we will get to where literally the deficit is going to represent 61% of our entire economy. That is a stunning path to be on, Madam President, why it cries out for us to take the steps that are necessary to get our country back on the right fiscal track. Interest on the debt, half of which is paid to foreign debtors, would comprise nearly 9% of our entire economy. Now, what's interesting about interest on the debt, because we all talk about the impact of carrying this amount of debt, and today we have so much debt that in a few years, the amount that we pay for interest will exceed the amount that we spend on national security. In other words, we will spend more financing our debt, simply making the interest payments, than we do defending the country. But think about that. Think about where we have gotten to in this country. And think about the fact, too, Madam President, that if we saw even a 1% increase in interest rates, if interest rates went up 1%, and we had to pay more to borrow money from those creditors, some of which are foreign countries, it would increase the interest that we pay annually by $140 billion. That is how sensitive we are to a slight increase in interest rates because of this massive amount of debt. We just passed yesterday, the day before, the $14.3 trillion level, the debt limit. We're going to have to raise the debt limit here. We don't know exactly when, sometime in July, sometime perhaps in August, but in any event, that's coming. We've maxed out our credit card, our borrowing authority we've hit the limit on that, and in order to keep the government functioning, we're going to have to increase the amount that our country borrows. And if we followed the President's budget, we would double that in the next decade. We'll go from $14.3 trillion literally to almost over $26 trillion in the next decade under the President's budget. Why? Because the President didn't make any attempt in his budget to reduce spending or to reform these entitlement programs to which I just referred. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the big drivers of federal spending. And if we don't take steps to reform those entitlement programs, this picture gets worse and worse over time. And I just want to illustrate that with one last chart, Madam President. This is where we are today, and this is debt as a share of our economy, which, as I said before, if you look at historical averages, what we've carried in the form of debt, in World War II, obviously there was a big ramp up because we had to finance the war, and then coming out of the war as the economy started to expand and we got spending under control, we got the debt as a percentage of our entire economy started to come down to more of a historical average, which is where it stayed literally for about 40 to 50 years. But then again, it started to spike here, starts to spike in the last couple of years as we've seen spending increase. And the reason for that is because the amount that we spend as a percentage of our total economy has continued to tick up. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're looking at, what was the number here, 25.9% of GDP is what we will spend on the federal government in 2020, according to the Congressional Budget Office's alternative fiscal scenario. If you think about that, the amount that we've spent historically as a percent of our economy on the federal government has been 20.6%. That's been the 40-year average. So we are going from 20.6% 40-year average spending as a percent of our entire economy. That's the amount that government constitutes, federal government at least, of what our entire economic output is, to 25.9% a decade from now. So federal spending continues to spike up. And when it does, because we're having to finance so much of our spending with borrowing, the borrowing level increases dramatically to the point where we're looking at debt to GDP on this path right here. If we don't take steps to change it, this is what we're looking at. It is a straight up spike in the amount of borrowing to GDP. And pointed out, I guess I would say too, by where we are currently. Right now, we're running, somewhere in the $1.4, $1.6 trillion annual deficits on $3.8 trillion in total spending, which means that out of every dollar that the federal government is spending, we are borrowing over 40 cents. Now, can you imagine any family or business in this country that could continue to get by borrowing literally over 40 cents out of every dollar that they spend? You can't do it. That would be like the average family in this country having an annual income of about $60,000 and spending $110,000. You can't do that. The federal government's been doing it for way too long. And that's why we have to take on this issue of spending and debt. Now, some people would argue that we don't have enough revenues. They'll say that we need to raise taxes, that the way that we deal with this fiscal crisis is to get more revenue coming into the federal government. I would argue, Madam President, based upon these facts, that this is not a revenue problem. This is a spending problem. The reason we are where we are is not because we don't have enough revenue. It's because we are spending dramatically more as a percentage of our entire economy than we have literally for the past 40 to 50 years. If you look at the historical average, 20.6% over the last 40 years is what we have spent on the federal government as a percentage of our entire economic output, our entire economy. And today that's 24%. As I said, by the year 2020, we're looking at over 25%, an increase of 25% in the amount that we are spending on the federal government as a percentage of our entire economy. This is a spending problem. This is not a revenue problem. We need to address it, we need to recognize it, and we need to understand that the only way we can fix it is to deal with what is driving that spending. It is Social Security, it is Medicare, it is Medicaid. Those three programs comprise 55 to 60% of all of government spending. And absent reforms to those programs, this is what we will end up with. This is where we will be as a nation, and that is certainly someplace I don't think most Americans want to go. Now, the other reason it's critically important, and I've said this before on the floor and I'll say it again, that has implications not only for future generations, but it has implications in the here and now. One of which is, when you are carrying this kind of debt to GDP, sustaining this kind of a debt level, it impacts your economy's ability to create jobs because you're crowding out private investment that otherwise would be allocated to more productive uses, and you're spending it on government. You're also impacting interest rates and inflation in ways that could be counter to the economic expansion and growth and job creation in the country. And there's been a great amount of research and study that's gone into at what level does that really start to take away from economic growth, economic expansion, and job creation. And the Two people who recently put a book out on this, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, suggested from their study of countries, mostly developed countries over the last half century, that when your debt to GDP reaches 90%, it is costing you about 1 percentage point of economic growth every year. Well, in this country, losing 1 percentage point of economic growth costs us about 1 million jobs in our economy. So if we say we're serious about job creation, one of the things that we clearly ought to be focused on is getting spending and debt under control. Because if we sustain and carry this kind of debt level for the foreseeable future, we are going to cost the economy 1 percentage point of economic growth and therefore a significant amount of jobs that otherwise might have been created by that economy. That's one reason we need to rein it in. The other one I'll point out is the statement that's been made repeatedly by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who has said the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to speak for another minute.
Without objection.
And so I would say that the national security implications of this are very real as well. When you have the highest-ranking military official saying that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt, that is a stunning, stunning statement. And I think speaks volumes about why it's important that we get this issue under control. One of the reasons he says that, obviously, is because so much of the debt is held by foreign countries, all of which have additional leverage on us because we owe them so much money. We need to get the spending under control. We need to get the debt dealt with. That starts with entitlement reform, and I hope the discussions that are currently occurring between the White House and some of the leaders here in Congress will come to a result where we can work together and use this as an opportunity to, for once and for all, put this country back on a fiscal track that will ensure that future generations are not burdened and saddled with an enormous amount of debt and an economy that is saddled with the weight and not able to create the jobs to get people back to work and to grow and prosper and create a higher quality of living and a higher standard of living for the next generation. Madam President, I yield the floor.